Hello everyone, my name is Eddie Bolen. I'm the pastor at Edgewater United Methodist Church. I'm also the pastor at Midway United Methodist Church. I want to thank you so much for taking some time and for watching this video today. I do want to invite you to come and join us for worship at Edgewater United Methodist Church and also at Midway United Methodist Church. At Edgewater, we will be meeting inside the sanctuary at 9:20 a.m. and at Midway, we will be meeting inside the sanctuary at 10:45 a.m. and all of you are invited to come. If you're interested in planning a time to come, are a couple things I'd like for you to consider, and that is to check your temperature before you come. In the midst of COVID-19, we are encouraging you to check your temperature. If you feel sick, if you feel ill, then take that opportunity to stay home. And also, if you would like to come, you're required to wear a face mask. If you do not have a face mask, one will be provided for you when you come into the church. You are required to wear that in the church as well as around the parking lot and to keep it on the entire time that you are in the church. And also, you are required to practice social distancing when you are in the church and when you are worshiping with us. And in addition, you will notice that there will be no contact during the service. Offering plates will not be passed, as well as anything else will not be passed around. And so you will be in an environment that is clean, that is safe, that is healthy for everyone. So again, if you'd like to join us for in-person worship, 9:20 a.m. at Edgewater United Methodist Church and at 10:45 a.m. at Midway United Methodist Church. In this video, what I'd like to do is I would like to have a conversation. Let us come together around this conversation about the three essentials of discipleship. Now, I'm not sure if discipleship is a phrase or if it's a concept that you use a whole lot in your life. You may have heard about disciples historically. You might have heard about discipleship in philosophy. Aristotle will say this. The philosopher Aristotle says that a true disciple shows his appreciation by reaching further than his teacher. And Socrates, another philosopher, will say this, that a true disciple of philosophy is likely to be misunderstood by other men. This idea of discipleship is one that existed before Jesus came into this world. And in John chapter 3, there's a really interesting idea about discipleship. When Jesus comes into the world, John chapter 3, starting at verse 35, and I encourage you to take a minute and to find that scripture, but in John chapter 3, verse 35, as Jesus comes into this world, he encounters John the Baptist. And he comes to John the Baptist. The next day, John again, that is John the Baptist, this is John chapter 1, verse 35. The next day, John the Baptist again was standing with two of his disciples, that is, people who were disciples of John the Baptist. And as he watched Jesus walk by, John the Baptist exclaimed, "Look, here is the Lamb of God." And the two disciples heard him say this, and then they followed Jesus. And that's one of the things that a disciple is. A disciple is someone who follows someone else. And so John the Baptist's disciples went away from John the Baptist and began following Jesus. And when Jesus turned around and saw them following him, he said to them, "What are you looking for?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which translated, it means teacher, "where are you staying?" And he said to them, "Come and see." And that's part of what I want to do today, is that I want us to talk about that come and see part of discipleship. There are three just really essential parts of discipleship. Disciples are people who essentially, they begin following a teacher, and they are people that are changed. They are formed over time. And what disciples do, as John shows us, as these disciples of John the Baptist leave, and they oftentimes will do that. They leave one teacher and they will start following another teacher. And as they leave John the Baptist, and as they begin following Jesus, you will find them as Jesus has turned to them and said, "I want you to come and see." And that is what a disciple of Jesus does. A disciple that is unique, that stands outside of philosophy, that stands outside of any other discipleship process or any other discipleship kind of mentoring. That if you are a disciple of Jesus, one of the things that will begin to happen to you over time is that you will begin to see what Jesus sees. And I want you to imagine this. I want you to imagine just thinking about that idea that a disciple is someone who sees what Jesus sees. I want you to imagine to do this, to imagine a really big crowd, just this large crowd. And as you can begin to imagine this large crowd, maybe it's inside, maybe it's outside, but there's a big crowd that is gathered around. You're not a part of the crowd. You're just, observing it. You're looking out. And then I want you to imagine that getting up to a space where you are above the crowd. Getting up high where you are able to really see more of the crowd that is there. And then I wonder if you can imagine this crowd that is in front of you, and now you are on this high place that is just looking over the crowd. I want you to imagine standing to the edge of that high place that you find yourself on, and imagine just hanging your toes off the very edge. And then as the people come forward, I want you to imagine, would you ever in your wildest dreams thinking, hey, if I go out into this crowd, they're going to catch me and they're going to hold me up. And then they're going to begin to move me. They're going to begin to move me on top of the crowd, and I'm going to go from end to end with this crowd, and they're going to catch me. That is something that happens. That is something, and if you have not seen it before, I want to give you permission right now. I want to tell you to take a minute and pause the video and then just pull up your search engine. Just pull up Google and Google crowd surfing. And what you will find is that there are many videos, there are many images of crowd surfing, and a lot of times what happens is that there is a band, there is another group that comes together, and there are people that have come just to see that band. There are people that have come in the crowd, they have paid money, oftentimes they have paid a lot of money, and then at some point the leaders of that band have looked at this enthusiastic crowd, this crowd that has so much enthusiasm for them, and they've recognized that if we fall on top of this crowd, they will catch us because they have come here to see us, they have come here to support us, and they will not let anything happen to us. And so crowd surfing. Well, as strange as that may seem, as this concept and as this image, what I want you to do is I want you to begin to think about that. And I specifically want you to begin to think about that. And again, turn into the New Testament, away from the Gospel of John. But if you have the scriptures close by, turn to Matthew chapter 9. Because in Matthew chapter 9, Jesus will be with his disciples, people who have done what Jesus first said to those disciples, and in fact the same people. They have come with Jesus to see what Jesus sees. And when Jesus saw the crowds, that is, when he looked at this big crowd that is there, that has gathered, he had this image, and it wasn't crowd surfing, but it was just as unique to his disciples. He begins to see the crowd and then turns to his disciples and said, look at this crowd that is here. Matthew 9:36. They are like sheep without a shepherd. You see, where the disciples may be tempted to only see just this mass of people that are gathered, Jesus specifically sees, and he says this whole group of people, this crowd that is there, they are like sheep that are without a shepherd. It's a new way of seeing a crowd. And that's what a disciple does, is that a disciple begins to see as Jesus sees. Jesus will tell this parable in the Gospel of Matthew, a little bit further down in Matthew chapter 13. He will tell this parable about a kind of field of dreams. And a parable is specifically, it reveals some truth to us. It points toward a truth, but it does it in a unique and an interesting way. And in this particular parable, Jesus will tell this story that points towards some truth, a parable, and he will say that there was a man who bought some very good seed. And he went out and he sowed his seed. That is, that he spread the seed and planted the seed. And then what happened as the seed began to sprout, weeds started popping up into the seed. And so the man who had planted the seed, the man who had bought the seed, the man who had planted the seed, then his hired people came to him and they said, hey, look at this field. There's weeds that are starting to pop up. Did you not buy very good seed? All these weeds are there. And so what happened? And the man looked at the field and he begins to say, he says, well, you know what happened here? I did buy very good seed. In fact, this was the best seed that I could buy. But what has happened, and this is the kind of interesting part about the parable, he says what has happened is that there is an enemy that has come in the middle of the night. And this enemy has sowed some bad seed among all the good seed. And so his hired people that are there to work in the fields, they jump up and they say, well, what do you want us to do about this? Would you like for us to go out there? Would you like for us to begin to uproot the bad seed? Would you like for us to weed through the field? And he says, no, let them both grow together until the harvest. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd be eager. I'd be ready to go out and get rid of I wouldn't want to wait till the harvest. I'd be eager to reach for the Roundup and do some strategic weeding there. But he says, no, let them grow together until the harvest. And then in Matthew, that's Matthew chapter 13, verse 30, you can look up the parable. But then in Matthew 13:29, before that verse, this is what the master says. This is what the owner of the field says in this field of dreams. He says, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat that is growing along with them. Becoming a disciple means that you begin to see what Jesus sees. You see, this story of the parable says that good and bad seeds can grow together until the harvest. And then there will be a time to separate. There will be a time to go through the good seed and the bad seed, the wheat and the bad seed, the weeds that have grown among with the wheat. Seeing what Jesus sees, it takes us knowing what Jesus sees. This field of dreams that Jesus saw in this parable, where there is good seed and bad seed, and yet they are able to grow together. This way of looking out at the crowds and seeing that these are people who are sheep without a shepherd. Seeing what Jesus sees is a challenge for us 7 days a week. Because it doesn't come natural to us. And that's what I want you to understand, that about being a disciple of Jesus, specifically being a disciple of Jesus Christ, and being able to see, it means that you are seeing what Jesus sees. And oftentimes it doesn't come natural to us, because what we will see in that field is we will see the weeds. Even sometimes, and I know for me that this is what happens, I will see the weeds before I see the good seed, the wheat that is growing up. And in fact, I will oftentimes see the crowds rather than seeing that these are in fact sheep without a shepherd. But that essential part of discipleship, of seeing what Jesus sees, it leads us to this place where we will then feel what Jesus feels. When Jesus saw the crowds, back in Matthew 9:36, back to Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them. Now, in our life together at both Midway and Edgewater, this past year, we did a whole series of sermons talking about compassion. And one of those things that we recognize is that compassion is something that before we even do it, there's something that we feel inside us. We have this compassionate feeling. A lot of times it'll start in our stomachs, it'll move in our chest, but we feel compassionate. And that's what Jesus does. When he sees this crowd of people, Jesus sees this crowd of people and says, these are sheep without a shepherd. And as we step into that, as we move into this place where we begin to see what Jesus sees, then we will also begin to feel what Jesus feels. He had compassion for them. To feel what Jesus feels, just imagine the implications that could come from that. Just imagine what a difference it would make in your life if you were able to see what Jesus sees, and if you also were able to feel what Jesus feels. If you felt what Jesus felt, just imagine how your home will begin to change. If you were to feel what Jesus felt, just imagine how your school would begin to change. What difference would it make in your classroom? What difference would it make when you were just walking to your classroom? If you were able to feel what Jesus felt, imagine what a difference it would make in your 9 to 5. What kind of difference would it make in your job? What kind of difference would it make when you ate lunch? What kind of difference would it make when you were in the break room with your coworkers? If you were able to feel what Jesus feels, imagine if we had neighborhoods. Imagine if we had neighborhood meetings that were coming together. What if we had community leaders that were coming together, and then there were people that were a part of that? Imagine if you were part of your own neighborhood team that was coming together to think about what y'all can do in your neighborhood together. And what if you came in that and you felt what Jesus feels? Imagine what a difference it would make. Imagine what will begin to happen in your home, at school, at work, even in your own neighborhood. I had a wonderful couple one time, and they were part of a church. They've been part of this church for more than 40 years. And I had a conversation with them. We were sitting together. I was in their home, and we were having this conversation. And I said, "So, you've been part of this church for so long." And I said, how'd y'all find this church? What made you come here? Did you grow up here? They said, "No, we didn't grow up here." I said, in fact, we were looking for a church. And we came into the church, and we'd been to several churches. We had a couple more churches that we were planning on going to. And so we came into this church. And so we went through the service. It was okay. It wasn't spectacular by any means, but said, it was all right. We were part of that service. And they said at the very end of it, that the closing song, the closing hymn was, "There is a sweet, sweet spirit in this place." And said, as we were singing it together, said, I turned to my wife. This is what the man said. He said, I turned to my wife and said, smiled. She smiled back. And then said, when they both left the church and they got into their car, it was not anything unusual happened on the way out, but they both left the church. They got into their cars. And he said, he turned to her and he said, "You know what? I think we found our church." And then he told me. He said, this is what the difference was. He said that closing hymn that was there is a sweet, sweet spirit in this place. He said, we sang it, and he said, we felt that there was a sweet, sweet spirit in that church. And that's how we found the church. That's how we continue to come to that church for those 40 years. You see, our feelings, what we feel, it makes a big difference in our lives. And oftentimes we are not in touch with our feelings. Oftentimes we really don't know what is going on with our feelings. Jesus will say this in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. He will say, if any want to become my followers, you can even substitute the word disciple there. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. And so Jesus is laying out this idea about what it means to be a follower of Jesus, what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. It says, deny yourself. That is, deny your ego. Desire to deny the ego that has led you to this place, but then take up your cross and follow me. That is, deny your ego that has gotten you to this place, but then take up the feelings that are happening inside your heart and the feelings that are happening in your life right now, and take up your cross and follow me. You see, disciples is one of those essentials of discipleship. Disciples are people who feel the weight of the cross on their lives. To be a thriving disciple of Jesus, it means that you see what Jesus sees, and it means that you also feel the weight of that cross. You feel what Jesus feels. And one of the wonderful things about this is that the way that this comes together is that when you see what Jesus sees, you will begin to feel what Jesus feels. That compassion that Jesus felt as he saw this crowd who were like sheep without a shepherd. That when you see what Jesus sees, you will begin to feel what Jesus feels, and you will respond how Jesus responds. When Jesus saw the crowds in Matthew 9, back to Matthew chapter 9, that when Jesus saw the crowds in Matthew 9, verse 36, he began to define reality for the disciples. As he looked over that crowd and saw that these are people, is not just a faceless crowd, but I want you to take a minute and I want you to look and I want you to see this crowd that is here. And then Jesus turns to his disciples. He says, look at this crowd. These are sheep without a shepherd. And then he begins to say, let me tell you about what's really happening here. What's really going on here. I know you're starting to feel something that is deep down in you. I know you see this now, that you see that these are people who are sheep without a shepherd. I know that you're beginning to have these feelings here, but let me define what reality is here. Because there are two major challenges that you've got to face now. That the harvest is plentiful and laborers are few. It's Matthew 9, it's verse 36. There are many sheep, the harvest is plentiful, laborers are few, and there are not many shepherds. You see, that's what Jesus saw in the crowd. There's a whole lot of sheep that are here, but there aren't many shepherds. A rather depressing kind of reality that Jesus has just laid out in front of the disciples, right? And I mean, just think about it, that when you see what Jesus sees, you will begin to feel what Jesus feels. And I want you to imagine that if Jesus were defining reality for you, and Jesus could very well be defining reality for you, because we still, just if you begin to imagine, you still know those crowds that are there. You still know those crowds that people will oftentimes take advantage of, but those crowds that are there, and just think about that crowd that is coming into your mind, that is a crowd of people who are like sheep without a shepherd. And then take it a little bit further. When you imagine that crowd that is like a sheep without a shepherd, what does that do inside you? Now, it may be some work that we've got to work on together, to really get in touch with our feelings. But just that initial stage, what are you feeling when you imagine that crowd that you know who is existing like sheep without a shepherd? There are lots of sheep, but there are not many people to shepherd them, to guide them, to teach them, to even love them, to love them, have compassion for them, care about them. So this is that reality that Jesus begins to define. They begin to feel, they have seen this crowd, they have shielded. This is not just a faceless crowd. These are sheep without a shepherd. And now the harvest is plentiful among them, but the laborers are few. And so this kind of anxiety, this kind of urgency that begins to move, maybe even some compassion that begins to move among them. And then Jesus says, let me give you a vision. Again, Matthew 9, this is verse 38. Jesus gives them a vision of this challenging reality of the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. There are lots of sheep, but not many shepherds. Ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. This is why oftentimes that you will hear churches and communities talking about developing teams, ministry teams, talking about developing strategies, talking about setting out these plans, a 90-day plan, a 1-year plan, a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan, 10-year plan, because we recognize that. Ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. We see what Jesus sees. We feel what Jesus feels, and we recognize that we had to respond as Jesus would respond to this crowd. And so we do it with teams and strategies and plans. And this is the vision that Jesus gives to his disciples. Ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. But then I want you to see this. Take a look at Matthew chapter 10:1. Because in Matthew chapter 10:1, it's not only the vision that Jesus lays out, but then Jesus summoned his disciples. He summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over the unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. Because a disciple has these three essentials that are just part of their lives. That when you see what Jesus sees, you will begin to feel what Jesus feels, and then you will respond as Jesus responds. And so Jesus gives his disciples some authority, and they go out to cast out unclean spirits and to cure every disease and every sickness. Now, what is so extraordinary about Matthew chapter 10, verse 1, is that then if you look at Matthew chapter 9, verse 35, and I encourage you to do that, read both of those verses together. Read Matthew chapter 10, verse 1, you do this, and then turn to Matthew chapter 9, verse 35. And this is, just hear these words. Matthew 10, verse 1, then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. Matthew 9:35. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness. You see, the authority that Jesus passes on to his 12 disciples, the response that his 12 disciples do, is the very same response that Jesus was having when Jesus was part of this world. He has passed it on to his disciples. And that's what it means to be a disciple, is it means that you begin to see what Jesus sees, you begin to feel what Jesus feels, and then in fact you begin to respond as Jesus responds. And all of you are extraordinary. You do extraordinarily well at least one of these places. Maybe you're a person who is able to look at a crowd, and maybe you do. Maybe you see trust in a crowd. Maybe you do see a crowd and say, you know what, these are people who are like sheep without a shepherd. These are people that if I were to ask them, they would in fact catch me if I were to go crowd surfing among this group. Some of you are able to feel. You may not really recognize, you may not see that crowd, but you're able to feel when there's a large crowd and you just feel that something's off, that something's missing, that this is in fact a group of people that are like sheep without a shepherd. And some of you are at that end and you know we've got to do something. You're always the one that is pushing everybody else and say, you know what, what's our response going to be? What's the team? What's the strategy? What's the plan? Let's calendar it in and let's start moving toward it. Let's get some clear goals and let's work in that direction. Well, what I want you to do is I want to challenge you to take a self-assessment. And I want you to challenge that, like I said, one of these areas you're going to do extraordinarily well with, but one of them you're going to be a little bit weaker with. And what I want to challenge you to do is just take this self-assessment among yourself. Again, read through Matthew 9:35 through 10:1. Just take a minute and read that scripture and then say, you know, where am I doing really well at? Am I seeing what Jesus sees? Am I feeling what Jesus sees? Am I feeling what Jesus feels? Am I responding the way that Jesus would respond? And then see where you're doing really well with, and then take that assessment and say, you know what? This is an area I need to work on. Not really feeling as much, or my response, you know, I've got the seeing, I've got the feeling, but my response is just off. And I want to encourage you to not just rely on your strength, but I want to encourage you to develop that. To develop maybe one of those areas that's kind of brand new to you, maybe an area that's a little weak, to do everything that you can to develop that. Because as you take that self-assessment, and as you recognize, you know, this is what I'm strong at, this is what I need to develop, then you can take that same assessment and you can bring it into your own home. And I want you to imagine this. I want you to imagine that if everybody that's a part of your home, everybody that's in your house, what if you were doing this together? What if they were seeing what Jesus sees, feeling what Jesus feels, and responding as Jesus responds? Imagine the conversations that you could have among each other as you really did this self-assessment together. And then imagine how your home would change. Imagine if you were able to have this conversation at work about seeing, about feeling, about responding. Imagine if you did this in your circle of friends. And that's what I want to encourage you to do, because this is something, what it means to be a disciple, and the essentials of discipleship, what those do in our lives is that they can make our homes, they can make our offices where we work, they can make our friends, the circle of people that we spend our time with, they can completely and radically change it. And if you want to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, well, this is what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. A disciple of Jesus Christ is somebody who begins to see what Jesus sees, who feels what Jesus feels, and then responds as Jesus responds. And so take that self-assessment. And then after you do, have some more conversations. Have that self-assessment with some other friends, some other people in your family, maybe some other co-workers. Again, thank you for watching. We will have in-person worship at Edgewater United Methodist Church and Midway United Methodist Church. Edgewater at 9:20 a.m., Midway at 10:45 a.m. Please stay safe. Please stay healthy during this time, and may God's grace, may God's peace be with all of you, both now and forevermore. Amen.